Welcome to the PIO Podcast, a place for everything public information related for police, fire, EMS, and local governments.
It was a good learning experience for a lot of us that social media is not real life.
But we have to remember the media are very rarely a target audience. They're simply that conduit.
Our words have impacts on individuals, and it may not be positive. So just being thoughtful and mindful of the words that we speak.
I think what's so interesting about this position too, and this job and this profession, is that every one of us is looking for purpose, and when we find it here, that's it.
To know is that a crisis for one is not necessarily a crisis for another.
Hello everyone, hope you're enjoying our content. If you would be so kind and click the link at the bottom of today's episode notes, your support in any amount will keep the podcast going. Whatever you can provide will keep the lights on and the podcast growing. So sit back and enjoy today's episode.
Good morning. Today on the PIO Podcast, we want to welcome Laura McElroy. She's from the McElroy Media Group. Laura, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Laura, so you have spent over 33 years in the field of communications, first as an award-winning journalist, the communications director for Tampa Police Department for over 13 years, and now as a communications strategist with McElroy Media Group. To say that you handled some of the most correct. To say that you have handled some high-profile crises is an understatement. Your background includes leading JICs for the RNC, multiple hurricanes, Super Bowl 43, which I did not realize, but also major racially tense officer-involved shootings, political protests, a sex scandal, and at a public agency, murder-suicide at a hospital. But you didn't stop there. You also one of 9 experts across the country reviewing the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, which I definitely want to talk to you about that. But you weren't done. You ended up going over to CPD, and you're part of the independent monitoring team to ensure that community members have a voice in reforming the police department. Holy cow. Wow. How do you have time to do anything? And you have a podcast that you do as well. So, Laura, this is outstanding to have you on the show.
I'm so glad to be here. It's enough to keep you busy, that's for sure.
I bet. Well, you got great ear miles, I'm sure, going back and forth.
I like those points.
Oh, those are great, I'll tell you. All right, so Laura, I ask all this of my guests that are from agencies or formerly from agencies. When you were at TPD, what was the population of Tampa, and how many civilian employees were there at that time?
There's right around 400,000 of the population, 1,000 sworn, about 350 civilians.
Oh, wow. So a decent sized organization. In your communications department, how was TPD staffed?
I expanded it to 5 during the time that I was there. There's myself and 2 assistant PIOs, and then a social media officer who led our team, our social media team that was made up of officers and dispatchers who worked throughout the department, but then would help us generate content. And then a Hispanic liaison officer. So we were a team of 5. We were small but mighty.
That's still not a bad sized team for a population of that size. That's a decent. You probably produced some amazing content out of that group.
We did. We did a lot of proactive messaging, very strategic in our approach, and would develop stories, pitch them to the media, and really serve them up on a silver platter. We would shoot video, line up interviews, have the stats pulled. We would help reporters turn their packages, and we'd be the ones pitching the ideas lots of times. So that's one of the things I try to get agencies to do around the country, because there's so much potential to tell our own story.
Yeah, and I was just reading an article that was put out by one of the public relations groups about pitching stories and how difficult it is to get your story to that reporter because of a bunch of different specific reasons. But part of it is staffing. Most of these reporting or news agencies are down to bare bones, and it's
That's
hard
true.
for them. And if you're producing those packages, almost putting them all into a happy thing, it saves them time and effort.
And because of that staffing shortage, we can look at it as a negative, but we can also leverage it as a positive, because there's so much time to fill. There's so much digital space, and all the stations and the newspapers have that digital space to fill. So if we're shooting video for them, lining up interviews, even shooting interviews for them, lots of times they will take it. If you ask them, they might say, well, we're not sure, we'll take it. But when it comes to being in a pinch and they don't have anyone to send, and you're like, I can send you video, it's on our YouTube site, it's password protected, you can download it, they go for it lots of times.
Yeah, and especially like sometimes if you even say, hey, give me the questions, we'll ask those questions if that's within the realm of possibility. And then they're not worried about, you just controlling the narrative in that sense, which in reality we are, but that's okay.
And what you said initially is that the reality is there's so few people to generate all that content. So if we can help them in that process, and if police departments can be strategic in the way they're developing that content, it can really help as far as building support for the officers and building community support for the police department.
So a few things, since we're coming up on DNC next week, you ran the JIC for the RNC. What challenges at the time were you faced with, and what challenges do you see that the DNC will face in Chicago?
The beauty of the RNC, it's a large scale planned event. And in the PIO world, as you know, Robert, you're dealing all the time with breaking news. You don't get to plan. You just have to hope that you have that plan in place ahead of time. So with the RNC, you have months and months, 18 months to put together a plan. And I think that's really the key to being successful, is put together a game plan, test that game plan, and then tweak it along the way. And so it worked for us in Tampa. The COPS office did an after action on our RNC with a pretty significant portion dedicated to our communication efforts. And the director of the U.S. Secret Service, the director of the communications, Anthony Guglielmi, who happens to be a good friend as well, he read our after action. We've talked through it as he has prepared for first the RNC and now the DNC. And he will be running the JIC, the Secret Service will be running the JIC in Chicago. And he has put together a pretty comprehensive, I'd say very comprehensive plan for the communications. And he had brought together this summer all the PIOs on the federal, state, and local level and tested the plan and tweaked it and improved it on the backside. So they've done the legwork, and I think they stand ready for the DNC.
Yeah, after seeing the RNC and how well it was run, the only issues that they ran into is where they brought officers from outside agencies in, and then they had an officer involved shooting.
That is a problem. That's a problem for all large-scale political events. And the key there is making sure that you are not just training your agency, but offering training and requiring training to those field force officers who are going to represent you and enforce the law in your city. And that really has to be done on the front end.
Yeah, you can't wait till day of. Definitely not going to work. All right, so Laura, you have talked about 5 key points of crisis communications, which are social media, staff meetings, rapid and frequent internal communications, connecting with your stakeholders, and finally being connected to the community prior to crisis unfolding. You don't need to talk about them all, but can you go into detail on a couple of these?
So social media, we always think about that as a way to push out information. And one of the systems that I put in place in Tampa of having a social media team is somebody is always on social media duty while they're working. So as a PIO responding to a critical incident, I could call dispatch, find out who's on social media duty, then call that officer and put them in the monitoring role of making sure that we have eyeballs on all the social media, that we're monitoring this event so that a false narrative doesn't creep up on us and that we're not prepared. And then making sure there's a system for that person who's monitoring the social media to get those updates to the PIO or to the commander who is making the operational decisions. Because when you're looking at the totality of the circumstances, you have to also consider public perception. What does the public believe is going on? And lots of times we'll see law enforcement be tone deaf because they're not paying attention. And so having that monitoring in place, and then quickly the next step is establishing your agency as the official source of information. Jumping out on Twitter, or if you're more if you're using Facebook more, but using social media to establish this is going to be the official source of information during this critical incident. And lots of times we don't see agencies take charge like that. And that's a critical role. We saw them do it in Nashville very well with their with their active shooter, also in Louisville. We saw it at Pulse, establishing this is the source of where you're going to get information.
Right.
And should I keep going or?
No, you know what? I wanted to ask you a real question here, a secondary question to that. So what is a recommendation for, and then you're a larger department, and what's a recommendation for the one-man PIO that, or even the person that's the part-time PIO, that's a sworn person that fills that duty during an incident? How do they manage that social media? What can they do, or what can they put in place prior to address that?
That's a really good question. They can't do it alone. If they're going to the scene, they're dealing with the chief. They're trying to make sure they're getting talking points together. If the chief is going to do the briefing, or if they're doing the briefing, they've got to focus on that content development and what's happening at the scene and managing the local media there at the scene. That means on the front end, you've got to put a game plan in place that you train somebody inside the department. And one person is not enough, because that person could be on vacation, out sick, in training, wherever. So you've got to have a couple of people who are trained, and that when you have a critical incident, that you can call on them as the PIO to help you in that monitoring process. Or you have to expand outside of your organization and have relationships regionally with other PIOs who are willing to back you up if you have a high profile critical incident, that they will go into that monitoring role for you. When we had 2 officers shot and killed in a single night in Tampa, we had a massive manhunt going on, and I used PIOs from other agencies to help us in that monitoring role, because we were extremely busy dealing with local and national media.
I appreciate you pointing that out, and that's what I was looking for, was that reaching out to other agencies, or even there are things called VOS, virtual social media teams, that you can create where you have somebody that might even be outside the region, because it might be a physical disaster and a natural disaster like a hurricane, where the whole region's affected and you can't utilize them, but you might be able to utilize somebody outside of the region.
Yeah, and the key is preparation and having that game plan in place.
I'd like to talk about staff meetings. Why is that important for the PIO? Why is that a key crisis communication point?
That's not on my list. I saw that and I was like, "What? Not sure what that is."
All right, I don't know where I read that. I apologize about that.
That's okay. The number 2 for me is establishing yourself as that official source of information.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So why is that important?
Well, obviously, we don't want people who think they saw something who becoming the eyewitness leading the newscast. We don't want the social media noise to fill the space. We want to make sure that the local community, that the local media, and if it's large enough, the national media is getting the correct information from the source. And if they are relying on people who think they heard something, who think they saw something, then they're going to get it wrong. And so it's in our best interest as law enforcement organizations to be very assertive, very proactive, and announcing this is where you're going to get the official information.
I'd like to shift to the school shooting in Uvalde. You were part of the DOJ's review team. Where did the failures in communications with the Texas Department of Public Safety occur?
So, starting at ground zero with that case, it started on the local level. The very first post that came out was 10 minutes after the gunman went into the school. It appeared at that point it was going to be a strong start to public communication. They immediately announced that there was a large police activity around the school and to stay away from that area. That came from Uvalde PD. But that, unfortunately, was the end of strong proactive communication. The next communication was 33 minutes later, And that came from the school district PIO, and it said that the students and staff were safe in the building. And so one of the key issues here is they put out incorrect information and they never corrected it. And when I asked the team there, why did you put this out? Did you believe this to be true? The answer was it had always been true in the past. And so they had a canned message that they used whenever they had a critical incident. And I'm an advocate of that. I'm an advocate of creating react statements for high-profile critical incidents, having them in the can, but they must be customized to the event at hand. Having that preparation done helps you on the front end, but you can't rely on it 100% when that critical incident happens. And in this case, they used a canned statement. It wasn't accurate. They never corrected the information. And then there was no JIC. There was no coordination. There was no planning of the communication. So you have the locals who 4 hours and 45 minutes later held a news conference. And then you have the Department of Public Safety sending a spokesperson to the scene who didn't know the locals were holding a news conference. And the locals didn't know that the state was out there at the scene doing live interviews with national media. So you've got two different entities talking, not coordinating their messaging, not making sure they have the information correct. And so it was just a calamity of errors. Unfortunately, there was just one error after another on the communication side.
So I'm just trying to understand this. So that the TDPS, they show up on the scene and they don't go talk, they don't go find the incident commander and the PIO that is from the local media or local jurisdiction?
Well, without going too deep into the operational side of it, they didn't ever set up incident command. So there was no incident commander.
Zero. Okay.
There was zero incident command. There was no one calling the shots. And so you had this massive influx of law enforcement officers, 377 of them, without getting direction. And so, again, it was a calamity of errors. And so there was no PIO on the scene that was managing the public information, that was managing the local media. The news conference that took place with the school district was 4 hours and 45 minutes later, the first one, and it was off-site. And so the PIO didn't respond to the site. She did have conversations with the PIO for the PD, but they were each generating content that was not consistent. So you've got one saying reunify with the children at this location, and another one saying reunify at this other location. So instead of one establishing that they are the lead and then everyone else sharing that content, you have both locals generating content, and then you have the state show up and their spokesperson just start doing interviews. So it appeared at that point that DPS took charge. But that actually didn't officially happen quite that early. But it was just a complete and total lack of coordination of what happened and what are you going to release and when you're going to release it. And so then you had hospitals. You have 4 different hospitals where the victims went to, 1 in Uvalde, 3 in San Antonio. They're all releasing information about victims. Can you imagine if you had, you have, as a member of the media, you're trying to count up through different tweets and posts of how many victims there are because you're not getting an official source of information. So it was just a worst case scenario.
Yeah, and it's mind-boggling in my experience to look at this from an insider and then trying from the outside perspective and say there are so many things that went wrong here that it's almost like, how did they not get at least a portion of this right after all the shootings that have happened over the years and all the training that has been available out there? And you have Texas Department of Public Safety, one of the largest agencies in the country, part of the Texas Rangers and all that other fun stuff. But even when the director was speaking at that scene, the next day, his information was incorrect as well.
Well, when we had the director on day 4 come out, it was to set the record straight. It was to say that it had been the wrong call not to go in. I'd been the wrong call to wait to get equipment and to call for more personnel and to look for the keys. All the decisions that were made, he came out and said, no, it was incorrect. But even when you are ready to clear the air and you're going to say, okay, an error has been made, then you should come right out and say exactly that. There's no way to polish it. I always say you can't polish a turd, so just flush it as fast as you can. And so, this was as bad as it gets. And he went through an hour news conference and didn't set the record straight until a reporter asked the question, why didn't you go in the door sooner? And that's when he came out and said, well, it was a mistake. They treated it as a barricaded subject instead of continuing to treat it as an active shooter. And so even when you're, clearing the air, that should be done in a proactive way of letting the community know, okay, there's a mistake made here. There needs to be an investigation. This is the process that's going to happen. But it was done in a very reactive way. So even when they were trying to set the record straight, it just was not a straight line. It was it just didn't unfold the way we would want it to.
Okay. So in the review that you guys came up with the report, what key takeaways can our listeners glean from the report if they haven't read it yet?
Well, when I was asked to do this work, and then every time that I prepare to get ready to talk about Uvalde, I always think about the children who lost their lives, the staffers, the two teachers who lost their lives. And really, if there's any silver lining, if there's any hope that these people didn't die in vain, it's in learning from what happened that day and hoping that through this process of reviewing it and creating the study that we can prevent some suffering from happening in another community. And I would say that the biggest takeaway is have a crisis communication plan. In law enforcement, cops have plans for everything. They write it down, they have a plan, they train on that plan. When a critical incident happens, they debrief, they update the plan, they retrain. And so when I came on board as a new PIO, I'm like, okay, well, where's the crisis comms plan? And it's like, that's one thing cops don't write down. Law enforcement agencies typically don't have a written crisis communication plan. And so that is, I would say, is the biggest takeaway. Have a crisis communication plan and test it. Use it. Use it when you have a weather event and you're shutting down roads because of flooding or lights out, or when you just have an incident with a large perimeter. Exercise your plan and figure out where your weaknesses are so that you can buffer that before the really big incident happens. I would say that's a primary takeaway. And making sure that your plan is not in a silo, that it's with your regional partners, and that when you test it, you bring in your partners so that they're connected to it and they know their role as well. Just like we saw in Uvalde, 2 different agencies generating content at the same time about the same incident. That there should be one lead agency that's clearly established. That's one example. And that you work out by practicing and testing your plan.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, like active shooter training for most agencies. They'll run active shooter training every year, and during that training, they may not even involve the PIO in that training at all. They'll say, oh, you've got to go through, if it's a sworn one, you have to go through the training, but not do your job that you're going to be doing no matter what.
Which is crazy. Any operational exercise that's for a critical incident should have a PIO component, because in real life, the PIO component is significant. It's high liability. We do all this training for high liability issues in law enforcement, but can you get any higher liability than the public's perception of you and whether or not they are supporting the officers who are out there putting their lives on the line? So any high liability training that is revolves around preparing for a critical incident should absolutely have a PIO component inside the department, but also regionally.
Yep, absolutely agree. All right, so let's switch gears here. Let's go to your work with CPD. One of the areas in their communication strategy was in the area of employee assistance and the Officers Wellness Support Program. In the past, CPD has struggled with suicides. They kind of led the nation in 1 year for number of suicides in the country. So how important is a strong internal communication strategy for officers?
You know, it has been such a difficult time to be the police in the United States in the last 3 or 4 years. First, the pandemic. What do I need to stay safe? What do I need to keep my officers safe? What equipment do I need? Am I going to bring something home and make my family sick? Before we can even answer those questions, we have the death of George Floyd, and we have unprecedented protest and civil unrest that has a very anti-law enforcement bent. And on the heels of that, we have a spike in violent crime nationally. And we have seen such an exodus of the police leaving law enforcement agencies. And so recruiting and retention is such a key issue for agencies. And I think it all starts at home. It starts with that internal communication plan of making sure that the inside audience is not the last one to find out what's happening about their agency. It's one of the biggest complaints I get when I travel around the country is commanders will say, why are we the last to find out? Why do I have to look at my phone to find out what's happening inside my agency? And so putting together a strong internal comms plan with someone dedicated to internal communications. That doesn't mean it's their only job, but if you have a large enough team that you can have that as a portion of somebody's job, or if you don't, if you're a small agency, then who has that task when there's a critical incident? And it can't be the PIO, because the PIO is running around with their hair on fire. Maybe it's somebody in the chief's office or somebody who's a strong writer that is going to draft that internal message to make sure that the chief can tweak it and then push that out, whether it's going to be recorded, videotaped, or it's just going to be a written message that goes out to your internal message, your internal audience, right before your news conference or right after your news conference. That you build a plan. If you're pushing out a critical incident video to the community and you have enough time to put together that entire critical incident video, then you have time to put together a message that goes to the internal audience. Because the way we're going to message, the words we're going to choose are slightly different. Still safe for public consumption if it gets leaked, but it's going to be a little different language than what we would use to the external audience. And so I can't emphasize it enough of how important it is for morale to put that energy into the internal comms and making sure that they're all marching to the beat of the same drum, that we are putting a focus on mission-oriented communication. Because if people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, they tend to be happier and they tend to stay in their jobs longer. So, are we doing enough to make sure that we're communicating our mission and making sure that they understand their value of what they bring to the organization?
Yeah, it's so important. And when I was in Colorado Springs, there were a lot of videos that we produced internally that went out to the officers and the staff, always ahead of a time, particularly when we had an arrest of an officer or an employee in a criminal act, or when we were changing policies and it was a major policy update. And then any arrest that we put out, it did not matter. They got it first before anybody else did. And that was always anywhere between 60 minutes to 2 hours prior to an incident going to the media if it wasn't high profile, just to make sure that they knew what was going on. And if it was an officer, they knew way before the media found out about it, because that's the last thing you want to do is have them go, I didn't know. Why didn't I know? Like you said,
That's
I heard
impressive.
it on CNN.
Sounds like you guys were doing it right, because I go to agencies where the internal comms just doesn't even exist. It's just an absolute afterthought. And then they're dealing, the rumor is always worse than reality.
Oh,
and we know the way the rumors spread like wildfire inside police departments. So
and cops don't spread rumors. Never.
Well, maybe just a little bit.
Yeah, just a tad. All right, Laura, so you brought up critical incident briefing videos. These are becoming really common amongst law enforcement agencies. Many have the policy where it's set to be released. Body-worn cameras stuff gets released within a set time frame. What are your thoughts on the video, the production work that goes to it, and the criticism that it might be edited?
So when I saw the very first one coming out of LA, I looked at it from the PIO perspective, and I was like, wow, this is beautiful. It's very well produced. It takes control of the narrative. It's all clearly laid out. Like, this is perfect. Then I step outside of that circle and step into my journalist circle, and I go, well, why is it so well produced? Like, what part did they leave out? Like, why does it have to be so scripted and structured? That doesn't leave room for me to ask any questions. So there is pros and cons to both. I think it is a huge step forward to be releasing the body-worn camera video. I'm part of the body-worn camera program with DOJ, and I'm a big advocate of having a set process that your community, your critics, your local media can depend upon. Good, bad, or ugly, that you will always release the video in the same time frame, which might be a week, might be 2 weeks. The law in California says 45 days, but they tend to do it faster. So whatever you decide, that you do it consistently, because that builds faith and trust in you as an organization.
Absolutely.
And so they know it doesn't matter if it's good, bad, or ugly, that it's coming. And if an officer makes a mistake, that is not an indictment of a police department. It just means we're made up of humans, and humans make mistakes. And the key is that the public should be able to depend on their agency to stand up and do the next right thing. And that's what those videos are about. It's a level of transparency. And so I believe they are a step in the right direction of getting the content out there and keeping the community informed. But I also feel that they should be released in the context of a news conference so that the chief can answer questions. Does that mean that he can answer or she can answer all the questions about the details of the investigation? No, lots of times you can't. But there is a level of accountability just by standing up there and being willing to be responsive to the questions to the best of their ability.
I agree with that. It should be done out in a press conference. So there is even if you can't answer the question, to have it asked in a public forum. So I agree with that. All right, so let's switch again. Let's go to artificial intelligence, because that is becoming a big issue. And I'm talking specifically about communications with an agency. What are your thoughts on its use, and where would you like to see it used, if at all?
When I was the director of communications of the Tampa Police Department, I put this enormous amount of pressure on the police officers who worked as PIOs to write these perfect news releases. Me with my red pen sending back their news release. And I think back that was a mistake. That was a mistake to put that much pressure on police officers who are not trained as journalists, not trained writers. And so having that level of expectation, I think that was a waste of energy, and that the value that they brought was their command presence, was their knowledge and understanding of police work. And so using AI, I would not be opposed to putting in the facts of an incident and using it to crank out a news release. Of course, it has to be edited. You can't just take what AI produces, but it could speed up that process. And I know that there are PIOs out there that are absolutely dead set against that. I see it as a tool. And just like we use Google as a tool to search and research, that doesn't mean we don't verify what gets spit out at us. But if we're the ones that are providing the facts, and then it gives us a sample and we edit that, if that speeds up our process, then I say that's a tool that should be used and could be used. And another way is, when I was a PIO, we had very understaffed media outlets that we would write their stories for them. We didn't just write the news release, we would write the article. And they would just put the reporter's byline on it, make a few changes, and publish it. And we see that happening all over the place today. And so if using that as a tool helps you produce more of that type of content so that you can get your story out there, I think that it should be used, and just used responsibly and with oversight.
Laura, what significant challenges do you see facing communication professionals in the public sector in the next 3 to 5 years?
The news business has evolved so much in the last 10 years, and I think it will continue to do so. I think it'll eventually be all digital. And the reality is the amount of money that they can sell ads for in the newspaper or on newscasts has plummeted because so many people get their news from their phone. And so as the audience declines, then the number of people the advertisers can reach is declining. So as their budget goes down, we all know the biggest thing of any budget is personnel. So what do they slash? They slash the experienced journalists and anchors who are at one point in time were driving most of the news coverage. And so they're replaced by these very young journalists who their primary skill set is technology. They'll drive themselves to a scene. They will shoot their own video, conduct their interviews, edit their own video, and then go live, streaming live on their phone or going live on TV with a backpack on. They're a one-man band, and their biggest skill set is that they can do it all on their phone. They know the technology, but they don't have the knowledge of being a journalist. And so that puts it on the PIOs to really be in a proactive role of developing content to get that content out to the media. It's not just a warm and fuzzy social media post, but it's understanding who we are as a police department. What's our brand? What's our mission? What's our values? How do we want to communicate that? And then using all your communication channels to reinforce who you are, what your mission is, what your values are. Being strategic and then developing content to get it out there. And I believe, just as we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, I believe that the media will take it. And lots of times PIOs will say, oh, they won't take the video. They will take it. They are very short staffed and they have tons of space to fill. If you build it, they will come. And so if you create the content, they will use it.
Great points. Laura, is there a question I should have asked? And if so, how would you have answered it?
You're really thorough. You're really good at this, Robert. You should have a podcast.
I'm getting better at it. I am getting better at it. All right, Laura, let's switch it up. Let's go to some rapid fire questions and I'll get you out of here quickly.
Okay.
Texting or talking?
Talking.
Vanilla or chocolate?
Chocolate.
Coffee, tea, or energy drink?
Coffee.
Adult drink of choice?
Dirty martini.
Guilty pleasure food?
Any dessert.
If you could have a superpower, what would it be?
Read people's mind.
It's a good one. Ask permission or beg for forgiveness?
Oh, beg for forgiveness.
PIOA.
Gotta get it done.
Yep. What place would you most like to travel to?
Prague. I'd like to go to Prague.
That's a beautiful city. Well, if you could choose to sit down with any historical figure, living or dead, who would it be?
Eleanor Roosevelt.
That would be an interesting conversation. All right, let's wrap it up. Final thoughts. What key points would you like our listeners to take from our interview today?
Write a crisis communication plan. It doesn't have to be a novel. It doesn't have to be a book. Have a couple of pages where you have a game plan and test that plan. Be proactive in your story development. Make sure that you are dialed in with the administration. What's their priority? What's their focus? And develop stories that push that out into your community. That's helping reinforce your brand of who you are as an organization. And just tell your own story. Don't depend on the local media to do it. Use all your communication channels to be proactive, develop content, and tell your own story.
Thank you. How can people best reach out to you if they want to connect or they want to, hire Laura McElroy's group?
Well, you can reach out to me at on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, Laura McElroy or McElroy Media Group. And my email is laura@McElroyMediaGroup.com.
And I'll add all that into the show notes.
Okay.
Laura, thank you very much for coming on the show.
It's been fun.
Yep, thank you, Laura. What a great opportunity this was, and I'm so happy that we were able to finish this up.
I want to give a shout out to Penny Maytack. She's the one that connected us to do this podcast together. I love Penny.
Yep, Penny is awesome. She's awesome, people. Just a great resource, especially in the Chicagoland area to talk to. So, yeah, Penny, thank you very much for connecting us. That's all for this week. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get notified on the latest episode. If you are listening on a platform that allows you to leave a review, please give us a review. Any review is appreciated. To support our efforts with the PIO podcast, you can click on the support button in the show notes, and any donation is appreciated. Thank you.